Long before the stone battlements of the Kremlin cast their shadows over the Moskva River, the vast expanse of the Eurasian plain was an unbroken sea of dark timber, treacherous bogs, and roaring waterways. This was a realm without natural frontiers, stretching from the frozen marshes of the Baltic to the sun-scorched grasslands of the Pontic steppe. In the dense northern forests, indigenous Finnic hunters and migrating East Slavic agriculturalists lived along the banks of life-giving rivers, clearing small patches of soil through backbreaking slash-and-burn cultivation. To survive in this unforgiving wilderness, a community had to understand the rhythm of the thaw, the movements of elk, and the sudden perils of the forest winter. Their world was entirely local, governed by the spirits of the woods and rivers, bound together only by shared dialects and ancient animist rites. Yet beneath the quiet canopy of the pine and birch, a network of arterial waterways was quietly waiting to bind this fragmented world to the great empires of the south. These rivers, the Fokhov, the Dnieper, the Western Двина, and the Volga, flowed like liquid highways across thousands of miles of wilderness. In the 8th and 9th centuries, restless Scandinavian seafarers known as the Varangians began pushing their shallow draft longships into these very river networks. Driven by a hunger for silver, trade goods, and adventure, these Norsemen were not merely raiders, but armed merchants of extraordinary endurance. They navigated the treacherous rapids of the Dnieper and dragged their vessels overland along ancient portages, where logs were greased with animal fat to slide heavy hulls from one river basin to the next. Along their southern trajectory lay the legendary wealth of Constantinople, which they called Tsargrad, the city of the Caesars, and the distant silver markets of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. To fuel this lucrative commerce, the Varangians extracted tribute from the local Slavic and Finnic tribes in the form of precious northern commodities: dark marten pelts, translucent amber, honey, wax, and enslaved captives. Over generations of seasonal trading and winter garrisons, the Scandinavian armed elites began to settle permanently along the major river junctions. They mingled their blood, their speech, and their military customs with the surrounding East Slavic majority, planting the raw seeds of a brand new civilization. According to the ancient primary chronicle compiled centuries later by the monk Nestor, the quarreling tribes of the north eventually grew exhausted by their own blood feuds and lawlessness. In the year 862, they sent a fateful message across the sea to a Varangian chieftain named Rurik, imploring him to come and bring order to a land that was vast and rich, but devoid of justice. Whether this invitation was a literal historical event or a retrospective dynastic legend, Rurik arrived with his armed retinue and established his princely seat at the fortified settlement of Ladoga and later at Novgorod. His descendants, the Rurikid dynasty, would hold the monopoly on sovereign power in the eastern lands for more than 700 years. After Rurik's death, his kinsman Prince Oleg gathered an army of Norsemen, Slavs, and Finns and led a daring expedition south along the Dnieper River. In 882, Oleg captured the strategic bluff of Kiev, assassinated the local Scandinavian warlords Askold and Dr, and proclaimed Kiev to be the mother of Rus cities. By uniting the northern trade hubs around Lake Ilmen with the fertile southern reaches of the Dnieper, Oleg created the foundational axis of a new polity known to history as Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was never a centralized or bureaucratic empire in the modern sense, but rather a sprawling, dynamic federation of river principalities bound together by a shared dynasty, commercial interests, and common defense. Every winter, the Grand Prince of Kiev would ride out with his armed retinue, the Druzina, on a prolonged circuit known as the Polyudi. For months, the prince traveled from settlement to settlement across the frozen forest tracts, collecting taxes in raw furs, tallow, and grain, while administering rough justice beneath the timber roofs of local strongholds. When spring arrived and the ice broke upon the Dnieper, the collected wealth was loaded onto fleets of hollowed-out log boats and floated down to the Black Sea, guarded heavily against the horse archers of the steppe. The ruler who pushed this early warrior state to its absolute martial zenith was Prince Sviatoslav the Brave, a fierce pagan prince who spent his entire adult life on campaign. Sviatoslav disdained the luxuries of palace life, sleeping on the ground with a saddle beneath his head and eating horseflesh roasted over open coals. In a series of lightning strikes, he smashed the powerful Khazar Khaganate to the south, humbled the Danube Bulgars, and challenged the Byzantine Empire itself before falling in a steppe ambush at the Dnieper Cataracts. Sviatoslav's violent death left behind a dangerous vacuum, plunging his sons into a vicious civil war that ultimately brought his youngest son, Vladimir, to the throne of Kiev. Vladimir was a man of intense appetites and acute political instincts, who initially sought to consolidate his authority by erecting a grand pagan pantheon on the hills overlooking the Dnieper. The terrifying idols of Purin, the god of thunder and war, and Mokosh, the goddess of earth and fertility, were adorned with silver heads and golden mustaches, receiving lavish animal and human sacrifices. Yet Vladimir soon realized that a fractured collection of tribal gods could never provide ideological unity for a state competing with the monotheistic empires of the medieval world. According to legend, Vladimir sent out envoys to examine the great faiths, Western Latin Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Eastern Byzantine Orthodoxy. When his emissaries returned from Constantinople, they spoke breathlessly of Hagia Sophia, confessing that during the divine liturgy they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth. The decision to embrace Byzantine Orthodoxy in 988 was a monumental civilizational pivot, linking the fate of the Rus forever with the spiritual, legal, and artistic heritage of Eastern Rome. The mass baptism of the population in the swirling waters of the Dnieper signaled the dramatic transformation of Rus culture from the ground up. Pagan idols were hacked down, dragged through the mud, and cast into the river, while Byzantine architects, icon painters, and scribes flooded into Kiev to construct monumental stone cathedrals. Along with Christian theology came the Cyrillic alphabet, which allowed for the rapid translation of sacred scripture and the recording of administrative and dynastic chronicles. The Church brought a comprehensive system of canon law, new concepts of royal legitimacy, and an institutional continuity that could survive the rise and fall of individual princes. Under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus entered its undisputed golden age of culture, literacy, and diplomatic prominence. Yaroslav commissioned the breathtaking Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, whose golden mosaics and soaring frescoes were designed to rival the splendor of Constantinople itself. He codified the Russkaya Pravda, the first written legal code of the Rus, which systematically regulated property disputes, commercial debts, and compensation for bodily harm, replacing raw blood feuds with structured monetary fines. Yaroslav's court became so prestigious that kings across Europe competed to marry his daughters, establishing matrimonial alliances with the royal houses of France, Norway, Hungary, and Poland. Yet beneath this outward magnificence lay a structural flaw in the mechanisms of dynastic succession that would eventually tear Kievan Rus apart. Instead of passing sovereign authority directly from father to eldest son, the Rurikid dynasty practiced a complex lateral succession system known as the rota system. Power was meant to pass from older brother to younger brother, and only then down to the eldest nephew, with princes continually moving up a ladder of increasingly prestigious provincial thrones toward the ultimate prize of Kiev. Whenever a grand prince died, this dynamic triggered a chaotic reshuffling of provincial seats, sparking intense jealousy, diplomatic intrigues, and open civil wars among royal cousins. In 1097, the leading princes met at the Congress of Lubeck to halt the internecine slaughter, agreeing to the principle that each prince should rule peacefully within his own inherited patrimony. Although celebrated rulers like Vladimir Monomakh managed through personal prestige and military brilliance to temporarily restore stability, the centrifugal forces of local dynastic ambition proved impossible to stop. By the mid-12th century, Kievan Rus had fractured into more than a dozen independent, competing principalities, each developing its own unique political and social character. In the far north, the wealthy merchant city of Novgorod the Great evolved into a de facto aristocratic republic, dominated by an influential town assembly called the Vesh and a powerful merchant elite. Novgorod thrived on the lucrative fur and wax trade with the Baltic ports of the German Hanseatic League, using its harsh climate and surrounding bogs as a shield against meddling princes. To the southwest, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia established close diplomatic and cultural ties with Poland and Hungary, dominated by an entrenched class of wealthy landowning aristocrats known as boyars. Meanwhile, in the northeastern forest heartland between the Oka and Volga rivers, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal began to rise under aggressive, centralizing princes like Andrei Bogolyubsky. Andrei deliberately broke with the old tradition of seeking the throne of Kiev, choosing instead to sack the ancient capital in 1169 and carry its sacred icons and treasures north to his new seat in Vladimir. This northeastern forest frontier was characterized by a more autocratic style of princely rule, laying the geographic and political foundation for what would eventually become the Muscovite state. While the Rurikid princes exhausted their treasuries and spilled their people's blood in pointless territorial disputes, an apocalyptic storm was silently gathering beyond the eastern horizon. In the high steppes of Inner Asia, a charismatic warrior named Temujin had united the nomadic tribes under the title of Genghis Khan, forging the most lethal military machine the medieval world had ever witnessed. In 1223, a mobile Mongol reconnaissance force commanded by the brilliant generals Subutai and Jib crossed the Caucasus Mountains and swept into the southern steppe. The terrified Cuman nomads appealed to their former enemies, the Rus princes, warning them that if they did not unite to stop this unknown invader, their own lands would soon be trampled into dust. A grand coalition of southern Rus princes marched out onto the open plains with their colorful banners and armored retinues, confident in their numbers and martial prowess. At the Khalkha River, the disciplined Mongol forces executed a masterclass in feigned retreat, drawing the overconfident Rus knights into a disordered pursuit across the parched plain before turning to surround and annihilate them. The captured princes were bound, thrown beneath a heavy wooden platform, and slowly crushed to death, while the victorious Mongol generals held their victory banquet directly on top of them. Despite this terrifying encounter, the surviving Rus princes failed to draw the necessary lessons, quickly resuming their petty feuds as soon as the Mongol scouts vanished back into the eastern plains. 14 years later, in the bitter winter of 1237, the full weight of the Mongol Empire returned under the leadership of Bada Khan, the grandson of Genghis, accompanied once again by the aging master strategist Subutai. Commanding an army of more than 100,000 horse archers, the Mongols utilized the frozen, snow-packed rivers as winter highways, moving with terrifying speed through the dense northeastern forests that had previously protected the Rus from nomadic raids. The border city of Ryazan was the first to face the onslaught, falling after a desperate 6-day siege during which Chinese-style siege catapults and flamethrowers reduced its wooden palisades to cinders. The chroniclers recorded that almost the entire population of Ryazan was put to the sword, with no eye left open to weep for the dead. City after city fell in rapid succession. Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, and Suzdal, their churches packed with terrified citizens who burned alive when the wooden rafters collapsed under Mongol fire arrows. At the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, the Grand Prince of Vladimir, Yuri II, was surrounded in his forest camp and slain along with his entire army, his severed head presented to Badu Khan as a war trophy. The Mongol war machine seemed completely unstoppable, turning south only after the spring thaw transformed the northern approaches to Novgorod into an impassable sea of liquid mud. Along their path of retreat, the small provincial town of Kozylsk mounted an astonishing defense, holding out for 7 grueling weeks and killing thousands of invaders before being utterly wiped off the face of the earth and branded by the Mongols as the evil city. In the autumn of 1240, Bada's armies gathered around the grand jewel of the Dnieper, ancient, golden-domed Kiev. The roar of the siege engines, the neighing of countless horses, and the screeching of ox-drawn carts were so deafening that people inside the walls could not hear one another speak. When the walls were finally breached, the citizens made a desperate final stand inside the Church of the Tides, until the weight of the refugees crammed onto the roof caused the ancient stone walls to collapse in a cloud of dust. Kiev was thoroughly sacked, reduced to a smoking ruin of human bones and shattered brick, marking the catastrophic, definitive end of the Kievan era of Russian history. What followed this apocalyptic destruction was not direct military occupation, but the installation of an enduring, highly sophisticated system of imperial exploitation that historians call the Mongol yoke. Batu Khan established his imperial capital at Sarai on the lower reaches of the Volga River, founding the great Western nomad Khanate known as the Golden Horde. The Rus principalities were reduced to vassal states, stripped of their foreign policy and forced to pay crippling annual tribute, known as the Dan, to the treasury of the Khan. To ensure maximum extraction, Mongol census takers and tax collectors, called baskaks, swept through every town and forest hamlet, counting every hearth, horse, and merchant stall. Any resistance was met with swift, devastating punitive expeditions that burned villages, laid waste to agricultural fields, and carried off tens of thousands of young men and women into the slave markets of the Mediterranean and Central Asia. The psychological impact of this perpetual terror was profound, instilling a deep sense of vulnerability and fatalism across all levels of Rus society. For more than 2 centuries, the political survival of any Rus prince depended entirely on his absolute submission to the will of an Asiatic overlord. To legitimately rule his own people, every prince was now forced to undertake the long, humiliating journey across the steppe to the court of the Khan at Sarai, or even to distant Karakorum in Mongolia. At the Horde's court, the prince was required to walk between purificatory fires to neutralize evil spirits, kneel in the dust before the imperial throne, and kiss the stirrup of the Khan. If the Khan was satisfied with the prince's loyalty and gifts of silver and furs, he would bestow upon him the yarlik, a bronze or wooden tablet functioning as a sacred patent of investiture. The most coveted prize among the ruling dynasty was the grand princely yarlik of Vladimir, which granted its holder seniority over all other princes and the lucrative right to collect and deliver the entire regional tribute. This system deliberately encouraged toxic factionalism, as rival Rurikid cousins spent fortunes bribing Mongol officials, spying on one another, and begging the Khan for military detachments to destroy their domestic rivals. The prince who navigated this treacherous landscape with the greatest pragmatic ruthlessness was Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod and later Grand Prince of Vladimir. Alexander achieved enduring military glory in his youth by defeating a Swedish invasion force on the Neva River in 1240 and crushing the heavily armored Crusader Knights of the Teutonic Order on the frozen ice of Lake Peipus in 1242. Yet Alexander made the cold, calculating decision that while the Western invaders sought to destroy the orthodox faith and culture of the Rus, the Mongols cared only for tribute and political submission. He actively collaborated with the Golden Horde, brutally suppressing anti-Mongol tax rebellions in Novgorod and personally traveling to Sarai to pledge his total obedience to the Khan. Alexander understood that open military resistance against the Horde at that moment was utter suicide, and that survival required patient, humiliating subservience until the balance of power shifted. His policy of accommodation protected the wounded heartland from further devastating raids, allowing the population to slowly recover and the church to preserve its spiritual infrastructure. Through this dark century of subjugation, a small, unremarkable forest settlement perched on the banks of the Muscovy River was quietly beginning its astonishing rise to dominance. In the mid-13th century, Moscow was nothing more than a modest wooden outpost surrounded by deep pine forests and stagnant peat bogs, lacking any ancient prestige or historical renown. It had been granted as a minor uppunnage to Daniel, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, who found himself surrounded by much older and wealthier rival cities such as Tver, Ryazan, and Novgorod. Yet Moscow possessed profound geographical advantages that were invisible at first glance to outside observers. Situated at the crossroads of vital trade routes linking the Baltic, the Volga, and the Black Sea river systems, Moscow was naturally protected from both nomadic steppe incursions and Western crusaders by a dense buffer of primeval forests. Displaced peasants, artisans, and merchant traders, fleeing the continuous devastation of the southern and western frontier zones, steadily migrated into the secure, quiet woodlands of the Muscovite realm. Daniel and his successors pursued a quiet, methodical policy of peaceful accumulation, carefully clearing land, purchasing small villages, and avoiding flamboyant, reckless military adventures. This cautious, calculating mindset became the generational hallmark of the early Muscovite princes, who treated state-building not as a chivalric tournament, but as an exercise in fiscal and administrative endurance. The real architect of Moscow's political ascendancy was Daniel's son, Ivan I, who earned the enduring historical nickname of Kalita, which translates literally to money bag. Ivan Kalita was a master of political sycophancy, fiscal discipline, and ruthless realpolitik, who recognized that the path to supremacy in the Rus lands ran directly through the cord of the Golden Horde. When the rival city of Tver erupted in a violent anti-Mongol uprising in 1327, killing the Khan's cousin and his armed escort, Kalita saw his golden opportunity. He rushed immediately to Sarai, secured command of a 50,000-strong joint Mongol-Muscovite punitive army, and led it against Tver, laying waste to the city and breaking his most dangerous regional rival forever. Deeply impressed by Kalita's loyalty and efficiency, Khan Uzbek granted him the Grand Princely Yarlik and appointed him the sole tax collector for all the Rus lands. Kalita collected the tribute with iron-fisted precision, skimming a substantial percentage off the top to fill his own private treasuries, which he then used to purchase entire towns and finance a network of dependent debtor princes. Kalita's most brilliant strategic triumph, however, was not financial, but spiritual, forging an unbreakable alliance between the rising power of Moscow and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, the supreme spiritual leader of the Eastern Slavic lands, had long since abandoned the ruined ruins of Kiev to reside in Vladimir. Kalita systematically courted Metropolitan Peter, offering him lavish land grants, judicial privileges, and the protective embrace of the Muscovite fortified citadel. When Metropolitan Peter died in Moscow in 1326, he was buried within the newly laid stone foundations of the Dormitian Cathedral, establishing Moscow as a sacred pilgrimage site. Peter's successor, Metropolitan Theognost, formally transferred the permanent seat of the entire Orthodox hierarchy to Moscow, declaring that the city was now the spiritual heart of the Rus world. This alliance gave the Muscovite princes an extraordinary ideological advantage over all their rivals, framing every territorial annexation not as naked Muscovite aggression, but as a holy crusade to protect and unify the Orthodox faithful. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde was beginning to tear itself apart from within through a chaotic succession of palace coups, civil wars, and regional secessions known as the Great Troubles. At the same time, the Black Death swept through Eurasia in the early 1350s, striking the wooden streets of Moscow and carrying off Ivan Kalita's capable son, Grand Prince Simeon the Proud, along with his entire immediate family. Out of this demographic and political wreckage emerged Kalita's young grandson, Prince Dmitry Ivanovich, who would become the first Muscovite ruler to openly challenge the military supremacy of the steppe. Dmitry realized that Moscow's growing economic strength and the political fragmentation of the Horde offered a historic window of opportunity that might never come again. He replaced the old oak palisades of the Moscow Kremlin with formidable, shining white limestone walls, transforming his capital into an impregnable fortress capable of withstanding both Mongol cavalry and Lithuanian sieges. When the powerful Mongol warlord Mamaye attempted to reassert absolute control over the recalcitrant Rus princes in 1380, Dmitry refused to pay the inflated tribute demands and mobilized a vast pan-Russian military coalition. On September 8, 1380, the two armies met on the mist-shrouded fields of Kulikovo, located near the confluence of the Don and Nepriava rivers. Before the battle, Dmitry had traveled to the deep forests of Radonez to seek the blessing of the revered holy elder Sergius, who prophesied a bloody victory and sent 2 warrior monks to ride in the front ranks. In a break with royal tradition, Grand Prince Dmitry discarded his imperial robes, dressed himself as an ordinary soldier, and fought directly on the front lines of the main regiment, taking heavy blows to his armor. The clash of bronze, iron, and bone was so immense that contemporary chronicles recorded the ground shook for miles around, and the river ran red with blood for 3 days. Just as the relentless Mongol horse archers were on the verge of breaking the exhausted Russian center, a fresh Muscovite ambush regiment, concealed in a nearby oak forest under Prince Vladimir the Bold, struck the Mongol flank with devastating force. Mamai's lines disintegrated in total panic, and the Mongol army was chased across the steppe and slaughtered in their thousands. The Battle of Kulikovo was a seismic psychological turning point in the history of Eastern Europe, proving for the first time that the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine could be decisively defeated in a pitched battle. Dmitry was granted the glorious honorific of Donskoy, meaning of the dawn, and the victory was immediately immortalized in epic poetry and religious chronicles as a holy resurrection of the Russian land. Yet the institutional reality of the Mongol yoke was not so easily broken by a single heroic afternoon of slaughter. Only 2 years later, in 1382, the legitimate Khan of the Golden Horde, Toktamish, reunited the steppe factions and marched a massive, vengeful army directly upon Moscow. Taking advantage of Dmitry Donskoy's absence in the north, Toktamish tricked the defenders into opening the Kremlin gates under the false promise of peace, before unleashing a horrific massacre that burned Moscow to the ground and killed 24,000 citizens. Dmitry was forced to resume the payment of annual tribute to the horde, but the balance of power had fundamentally, irreversibly shifted. In his final testament, Dmitry passed the Grand Principality directly to his son Vasily without bothering to ask for the Khan's permission, cementing the throne as a hereditary Muscovite possession. Throughout the long, grinding reign of Vasily I and the brutal quarter-century civil war that engulfed the reign of his son Vasily II, the Muscovite state continued to evolve toward absolute internal centralization. This dynastic civil war, fought between competing uncles and nephews over the rules of succession, brought immense devastation, seeing Vasily II captured, blinded with burning irons, and temporarily deposed by his ruthless rivals. Yet Vasily the Blind ultimately triumphed precisely because the administrative bureaucracy, the Moscow merchant class, and the high church hierarchy recognized that an undivided, autocratic throne was the only antidote to catastrophic social chaos. Blind and scarred, Vasily II ruled with cold, bureaucratic efficiency, systematically eliminating the independent appanage of his extended family and forging an administrative state that concentrated all military and judicial authority directly within the Kremlin. At the same time, the global geopolitical landscape shifted seismically in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks breached the ancient walls of Constantinople, bringing a violent end to the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire. The fall of the Second Rome sent a shockwave of grief and existential dread through the Orthodox world, leaving the Grand Principality of Moscow as the only independent Orthodox state left standing on the face of the earth. When Vasily the Blind died in 1462, he left the throne to his 22-year-old son, Ivan III, a man whose 43-year reign would permanently alter the geopolitical map of Eurasia and earn him the title of Ivan the Great. Ivan III was an exceptionally calculating, unhurried, and methodical statesman who possessed none of the wild emotional instability that would characterize his infamous grandson. He rarely led armies in person, preferring to sit in his council chambers for months, analyzing financial reports, diplomatic treaties, and logistical lines, allowing his capable generals to execute carefully planned campaigns. Ivan understood that the state he inherited was still theoretically surrounded by lethal enemies. The hostile Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the west, the splintered successor khanates of the Golden Horde to the south and east, and proud, independent Rus principalities on his immediate borders. His grand strategic vision was nothing less than the gathering of the Russian lands. The revolutionary claimed that every inch of territory once ruled by Kievan Rus belonged by divine and historical right to the sovereign of Moscow. The greatest immediate obstacle to Ivan's vision was the vast, fiercely independent merchant republic of Novgorod the Great, which controlled an immense Arctic and subarctic empire stretching all the way to the Ural Mountains. Novgorod had developed a vibrant, highly literate urban culture, where even ordinary women and shoemakers wrote everyday letters, contracts, and prayers on peeled birch bark strips preserved in the waterlogged soil. The proud Novgorodian patricians, terrified of Ivan's centralizing autocracy, forged a secret military alliance with the Catholic King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania to preserve their ancestral liberties. For Ivan, this was not merely political insubordination, but a treasonous betrayal of the Orthodox faith, giving him the moral and religious justification to launch a decisive holy war against the Republic in 1471. At the Battle of the Shilon River, Ivan's professional cavalry completely routed the poorly trained, divided militia of Novgorod, forcing the city to swear nominal allegiance to the Muscovite crown. Yet Ivan was not interested in halfway measures or temporary truces. He understood that as long as the civic institutions of Novgorod survived, the city would remain a perpetual hotbed of Western-leaning rebellion. In 1478, Ivan marched his armies back to Novgorod, completely surrounding the city and issuing an ultimatum that left no room for compromise. There would be no town assembly, no elected mayor, and no separate judicial system. The famous Vesh bell, which had rung out from the tower of St. Sophia Cathedral for centuries to summon the citizens to direct democratic debate, was unhooked, lowered into the mud, and dragged away in chains to Moscow. Ivan completely dismantled the Novgorodian merchant aristocracy, expropriating their vast estates and deporting more than 1,000 prominent families to the Muscovite interior, replacing them with loyal servants who held land directly from the Grand Prince. The historic Republic of Novgorod was entirely erased from the map, its immense wealth and vast northern fur reserves absorbed overnight into the swelling coffers of the Muscovite treasury. Having neutralized Novgorod and annexed the rival Principality of Tver in 1485, Ivan turned his cold, calculating gaze toward the lingering indignity of Mongol suzerainty. The Golden Horde had fractured into several competing entities: the Crimean Khanate, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, and the Great Horde, which still claimed supreme imperial authority over the Russian princes. In 1476, Ivan simply stopped paying the annual tribute to the Great Horde, and according to later dramatic chronicles, he publicly spat upon the Khan's seal and ordered his envoys executed when they arrived to demand payment. In the autumn of 1480, Khan Ahmed of the Great Horde mobilized a massive steppe army and marched toward the borders of Muscovy, determined to compel Ivan's submission through fire and sword. Ivan moved his forces south to meet the invaders, establishing a heavily fortified defensive line along the northern banks of the Ugra River, armed with modern cannons, harquebuses, and mobile timber palisades called Gulye Gorets. For weeks, the two massive armies faced each other across the narrow river, with the Mongol horse archers attempting multiple amphibious assaults that were repeatedly shattered by Muscovite artillery and concentrated musket fire. As the bitter autumn winds turned into winter frost and the river began to freeze over, both commanders realized that the decisive moment of engagement had arrived. Yet instead of a catastrophic, bloody clash of arms, the world witnessed an astonishing anticlimax. On November 11th, 1480, Khan Ahmed, running out of supplies, facing disease among his men, and hearing that his base camp was being raided by Muscovite allies, suddenly ordered a full retreat. The Muscovite forces watched in disbelief as the entire steppe host turned and vanished into the snowy southern horizon, never to return. The Great Stand on the Ugra River marked the quiet, bloodless, but definitive end of the 240-year Mongol yoke over the Russian lands. Moscow was now an entirely sovereign, independent great power, answerable to no earthly monarch, and free to project its immense military weight across the Eurasian continent. To govern this suddenly vast, multi-regional realm, Ivan III recognized that traditional feudal customs, unwritten legal traditions, and local princely loyalties were no longer sufficient. In 1497, he promulgated the Sudebnik, the first unified, comprehensive legal code of the centralized Muscovite state. The Sudebnik established standardized court procedures, fixed judicial fees, severe penalties for bribery and corruption, and established the Grand Prince as the Supreme Court of Appeal for all criminal and civil matters. Crucially, the code introduced Article 57, a seemingly modest regulation that would eventually lay the institutional foundation for the tragic centuries of Russian serfdom. Article 57 restricted the right of peasant farmers to leave their landlords to a single 2-week window each year, 1 week before and 1 week after St. George's Day in late autumn, after the harvest had been safely gathered. To exercise this right, The peasant had to pay a substantial exit fee, known as the posili, to compensate the landlord for the use of the house and land. In a land rich in soil but desperately poor in labor, this legal decree was the first decisive step in binding the agricultural population permanently to the soil and to the service of the state. Alongside the legal code, Ivan revolutionized the entire military and social structure of the realm by institutionalizing the pomesty system of conditional land tenure. Previously, the traditional boyar aristocracy held their ancestral estates, known as vachinas, as absolute, unconditional private property, allowing them to freely switch their allegiance to rival princes without losing their land. Ivan began granting newly annexed lands, particularly the confiscated estates of Novgorod, to a new class of service gentry called dvoryan, on the strict condition of continuous, lifelong military service to the Grand Prince. If a service nobleman failed to show up for a campaign fully armed with horse, bow, and armor, his land was instantly confiscated and handed to someone else. This brilliant administrative innovation created a vast, fiercely loyal military class whose social status, economic survival, and personal wealth depended entirely on the continued expansion and central authority of the Muscovite crown. The old, independent boyar aristocracy found themselves increasingly marginalized, forced to compete with this rising service class for prestige and administrative appointments within the Kremlin's expanding chanceries. Ivan understood with profound clarity that military and administrative power required an equally imposing visual and ideological language to command the respect of his own people and foreign courts. In 1472, Ivan made one of the most brilliant dynastic marriages in Russian history, wedding Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, who had died defending the walls of Constantinople. Sophia arrived in the snowy streets of Moscow accompanied by a large retinue of Greek scholars, diplomats, and Italian-trained humanists, bringing with her the refined ceremonial court rituals of the vanished Byzantine Empire. Through this marriage, Ivan claimed the imperial legacy of Eastern Rome, adopting the Byzantine double-headed eagle as the official heraldic crest of the Muscovite state. The Grand Prince ceased to be merely the first among princely equals. He began styling himself in diplomatic correspondence as sovereign of all Rus, and occasionally using the sacred title of Tsar, derived directly from the Latin Caesar. The ceremonial rituals of the court became rigidly hierarchical, designed to create a sense of awe, sacred distance, and absolute submission around the physical person of the monarch. To transform Moscow into a capital worthy of an imperial sovereign, Ivan invited master Italian architects and engineers to reconstruct the crumbling limestone structures of the Kremlin. The brilliant Bolognese architect Aristotele Fioravanti was commissioned to build the magnificent Dormition Cathedral, blending traditional Russian five-domed Orthodox design with the structural brilliance and proportional elegance of the Italian Renaissance. Fioravanti used deep oak pilings, manufactured new, stronger bricks, and utilized innovative hoisting machines to raise soaring stone vaults that gave the interior an astonishing sense of light, air, and majesty. Next came the Cathedral of the Annunciation, built by master craftsmen from Pskov as the private chapel of the royal family, and the Archangel Cathedral, designed by the Venetian architect Alovisio Novi to serve as the sacred burial vault of the Muscovite princes. Surrounding these breathtaking holy monuments rose the formidable, jagged red brick walls and massive fortified towers of the modern Kremlin, constructed by Italian military engineers between 1485 and 1495 to withstand any siege artillery known to the medieval world. Moscow had been physically transformed from a provincial wooden timber fortress into an imposing, stone and brick imperial acropolis. In the monastic cells and theological circles of the newly unified realm, this sudden convergence of sovereign independence, dynastic marriage, and architectural glory gave birth to a profound ideological concept known as the Third Rome. In a series of famous letters written to Ivan's son, Vasily III, the monk Philotheus of Pskov articulated a sacred historical vision that would echo through Russian imperial identity for centuries to come. Philotheus wrote that the First Rome had collapsed into ancient Western heresies and fallen to barbarian tribes, The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the infidel Ottoman Turks because it had compromised the purity of the Orthodox faith at the Council of Florence. Now, only the holy, sovereign realm of Moscow remained as the final, uncorrupted fortress of true Christian orthodoxy on earth. Two Romes have fallen, Philotheus famously declared. The third stands, and a fourth there shall not be. This third Rome ideology was not merely a poetic flourish, but a profound theological burden, framing the expanding Russian state not as a predatory empire, but as the divinely chosen, sacred protector of cosmic truth, charged with an apocalyptic destiny to preserve the faith until the end of time. Yet beneath the golden icons, the Italian-designed palaces, and the majestic imperial rhetoric, this newly forged Muscovite state rested upon an inherently fragile and dangerous foundation. The survival of the realm had been achieved through absolute political centralization, the systematic destruction of civic pluralism, and the total subjugation of the individual to the collective needs of the state. There was no independent parliament, no chartered free cities, no corporate legal rights, and no autonomous nobility capable of checking the arbitrary will of the sovereign. Every human being within the borders of Muscovy, from the humblest illiterate serf clearing frozen brush to the wealthiest boyar descended from Rurik himself, was legally defined merely as a kolop, a bondservant of the sovereign. Power was intensely concentrated in the hands of a single supreme ruler, whose personal whims, religious convictions, or descent into madness could instantly steer the entire state toward glory or total ruin. When Ivan the Great died in 1505, he left behind a colossal, unified state that had survived Mongol devastation and gathered an empire, but the stage was now irrevocably set for an era where that terrifyingly absolute power would be wielded without mercy, wisdom, or restraint. When Ivan III passed into the grave in 1505, the crown settled upon the head of his eldest son, Vasily III, who continued the patient work of consolidating Muscovite supremacy with an unyielding grip. Vasily completed the annexation of the ancient border principalities of Pskov and Ryazan, while prying the strategic fortress city of Smolensk away from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Yet for all his administrative achievements, the Grand Prince was consumed by a desperate personal crisis. After 20 years of marriage to Solomonia Saburova, the union had produced no living heir. Defying the vocal opposition of traditional church elders, Vasily forcibly banished his wife to a distant convent and married the young, Western-educated Lithuanian noblewoman Elena Glinskaya. In the late summer of 1530, amid a terrifying thunderstorm that contemporaries claimed shook the very foundations of the Kremlin, Elena gave birth to a male child named Ivan. The infant was celebrated across the realm as a divine blessing sent to secure the continuity of the Rurikid dynasty. However, the child's fragile security vanished when Vasily III suddenly contracted a lethal infection from a hunting injury and died in 1533, leaving 3-year-old Ivan as the nominal ruler of an unstable realm. Elena Glinskaya initially seized the regency with remarkable ferocity, executing dangerous dynastic uncles and introducing a standardized monetary system based on the silver kopeck. Her sudden, agonizing death in 1538, almost certainly caused by mercury poisoning orchestrated by rival aristocratic factions, left the 8-year-old Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Yuri completely orphaned within the palace. The Kremlin immediately devolved into a vicious battleground for competing boyar clans, primarily the Shuiskys and the Belskys, who plundered the imperial treasury and settled old blood feuds. Young Ivan was forced to witness horrific acts of violence, watching beloved tutors and guardians beaten, humiliated, or dragged away to the executioner's block in front of his eyes. In private chambers, the boy was often left poorly clothed, underfed, and subjected to the calculated insults of haughty aristocrats who treated him with contempt when public ceremonies concluded. This toxic environment of constant terror, betrayal, and humiliation forged a deeply suspicious, vindictive psychology in the young prince, convincing him that every nobleman was a traitor waiting for the right moment to strike. In the bitter winter of 1543, at the age of 13, Ivan staged his first decisive demonstration of lethal power by ordering his personal huntsman to seize Prince Andrei Shuiski and have him ripped apart by hunting dogs. 3 years later, having reached his 16th year, the young sovereign shocked the Boyar Council by declaring that he would not merely assume the traditional title of Grand Prince of Moscow. On January 16, 1547, in the candlelit sanctuary of the Dormition Cathedral, Metropolitan Makarii anointed Ivan with holy oil and crowned him as the first formal czar and autocrat of all Rus. The adoption of the imperial title of Caesar proclaimed to the world that Ivan was answerable to no human authority, deriving his supreme mandate directly from God Almighty. Shortly after his coronation, Ivan selected Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina Yurieva to be his bride from an empire-wide bridal showcase of aristocratic maidens. Anastasia proved to be a stabilizing and compassionate presence in the young monarch's turbulent life, offering him genuine affection and temporarily softening his volatile temper. In the summer of that same year, a cataclysmic fire swept through Moscow's wooden quarters, destroying thousands of homes, triggering violent urban riots, and convincing the young czar that divine wrath demanded sweeping moral and administrative reform. Shaken by the devastation of the capital, Ivan gathered a circle of enlightened and capable advisors known to history as the Chosen Council. Guided by the pragmatic courtier Alexei Adashev, the charismatic royal chaplain Sylvester, and Metropolitan Makarii, this informal cabinet embarked on a comprehensive restructuring of the Muscovite state. In 1549, Ivan convened the very first Zemsky Sobor, an expansive assembly of the land that brought together church leaders, boyars, and provincial service gentry to air grievances and restore social peace. The following year saw the promulgation of the Sudebnik of 1550, a reformed legal code that streamlined local judicial administration, curbed the rampant bribery of imperial governors, and expanded the rights of provincial communities. To break the state's reliance on undisciplined aristocratic cavalry militias, Ivan created the Streltsy, a permanent, standing corps of infantry armed with matchlock muskets, sabers, and curved poleaxes. The Great Church Council of 1551, named the Stoglav or Council of the 100 Chapters, standardized Orthodox rituals, reformed monastic finances, and initiated the widespread founding of parish schools. This brief, luminous decade demonstrated that the young czar was capable of visionary statesmanship, laying institutional pillars that modernized the administration and laid the groundwork for imperial expansion. With his domestic reforms well underway, Ivan directed the full military power of the renewed state eastward toward the Muslim Khanate of Kazan. For generations, Kazan horsemen had staged devastating slave raids deep into the Russian heartland, carrying off hundreds of thousands of captives to the markets of the east. In the summer of 1552, Ivan led an enormous expeditionary force of 150,000 men, equipped with advanced siege artillery and river flotillas, directly to the walls of the Tatar capital. Under the technical guidance of Danish and Russian engineers, massive wooden siege towers were rolled into position, while sappers placed subterranean gunpowder mines that blew enormous breaches in the fortress walls. On October 2, 1552, Muscovite troops stormed the city in a furious hand-to-hand assault, capturing the Khan, liberating thousands of Christian slaves, and permanently absorbing the Middle Volga basin. For years later, in 1556, Russian forces swept down the river to capture the southern Khanate of Astrakhan without firing a single cannon shot, securing the entire Volga waterway all the way to the Caspian Sea. To commemorate these historic triumphs over the steppe, Ivan ordered the construction of the Cathedral of the Intercession on the moat on the edge of the Red Square, an architectural marvel of swirling, multicolored domes that the world would come to revere as St. Basil's. Flushed with his sweeping victories along the Volga, Ivan turned his strategic ambitions westward toward the Baltic Sea, seeking an open maritime gateway for direct trade with Western Europe. In 1558, he launched the Livonian War against the decaying Livonian Confederation, capturing the vital trading ports of Narva and Dorpat in a whirlwind opening campaign. However, Ivan's aggressive push toward the sea provoked a massive regional conflict, drawing the formidable powers of Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark into a grinding coalition war against Muscovy. As the conflict dragged on for years without a decisive victory, internal fissures began to tear Ivan's court apart, with conservative boyars arguing that the Western campaign was draining the realm's treasury and manpower. The crisis deepened into personal tragedy in August 1560, when Tsaritsa Anastasia died suddenly after a brief, mysterious illness, plunging Ivan into an abyss of inconsolable grief and dark suspicion. Ivan became fanatically convinced that his beloved wife had been deliberately poisoned by envious boyars and members of his own chosen council who sought to control the throne. Sylvester and Adashev were immediately disgraced and banished to remote monasteries, while the sovereign's fragile mental stability shattered, clearing the path for raw, unchecked paranoia to dictate state policy. The Tsar's growing mistrust of his military commanders reached a fever pitch in 1564, when one of his most brilliant generals and closest confidants, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, defected to the King of Poland after suffering a battlefield defeat. From his safe haven abroad, Kurbsky penned blistering, eloquent letters accusing Ivan of butchering his most loyal commanders and ruling as an unchristian, bloodthirsty tyrant. Kurbsky's ideological betrayal shook Ivan to the core of his being, confirming his deepest childhood fears that every aristocrat was a traitor in disguise. In December 1564, Ivan orchestrated an extraordinary piece of political theater. He packed his family, his private treasury, and his most sacred icons into sledges and abruptly abandoned Moscow for the fortified village of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda. From his provincial retreat, Ivan issued two separate manifestos, one informing the Moscow townspeople that he bore them no ill will, and another declaring his total abdication due to the pervasive treason of the boyars and clergy. Terrified that the collapse of royal authority would ignite immediate foreign invasions and bloody peasant uprisings, a weeping delegation of merchants and commoners traveled to the village to beg the Tsar to return on whatever terms he saw fit. Ivan agreed to resume the throne only on the absolute condition that he be granted unquestioned authority to punish traitors without any interference from the church or the boyar council. In early 1565, the Tsar enacted a radical administrative decree that divided the entire realm into two distinct, competing zones, the Zemshchina and the Oprichnina. The Zemshchina remained under the traditional administration of the Boyar Duma, continuing to pay heavy taxes and shoulder the main burdens of the state. The Oprichnina, by contrast, was designated as the Tsar's private personal domain, encompassing wealthy trading districts, fertile agricultural lands, and strategic fortress towns across the realm. To enforce his absolute will within this private state, Ivan created a terrifying corps of black-clad guards known as the Oprichniki, who were drawn largely from the lower gentry and sworn solely to the sovereign. Riding black horses with severed dogs' heads and broom bristles tied to their saddles, the Oprichniki symbolized their holy mission to sniff out treason and sweep away the enemies of the Tsar. Headed by the sadistic and fiercely loyal enforcer Malyuta Skuratov, the Oprichniki unleashed a systematic campaign of terror against the ancient boyar families of Muscovy. Noblemen were dragged from their ancestral manors, subjected to horrific tortures in Kremlin dungeons, and publicly executed alongside their wives, children, and household servants. Their vast Vachino estates were confiscated by the crown and distributed among the Oprichniki, permanently fracturing the economic independence of the traditional Russian aristocracy. The only public figure with the moral courage to challenge this madness was Metropolitan Philip of Moscow, who repeatedly refused to bless the Tsar in public and denounced the senseless butchery from the pulpit of the Dormition Cathedral. Enraged by this open defiance, Ivan had Philip publicly stripped of his holy vestments, condemned on forged charges of treason, and banished to a monastery in Tver. In the winter of 1569, Malyuta Skuratov arrived at Philip's cold cell and personally smothered the saintly prelate to death with a pillow after the holy man refused to bestow his blessing upon the Oprichnina. The murder of the Metropolitan demonstrated to the entire population that no sacred office, noble bloodline, or ancestral status could provide a shield against the murderous wrath of the autocrat. In the bitter winter of 1570, Ivan turned his lethal fury upon the ancient merchant city of Novgorod, acting on fabricated reports that the local elite planned to surrender the city to the King of Poland. Leading an army of 15,000 Oprichniki across the frozen marshes, the Tsar surrounded Novgorod and sealed all its gates, ensuring that no man, woman, or child could escape. For 5 horrific weeks, the city was subjected to an apocalyptic sack that resembled a military conquest rather than a domestic policing operation. Thousands of prominent citizens, merchants, and monks were tied to sledges, dragged through the snow, and hurled into the freezing waters of the Fokhov River, with opportunity in boats spearing anyone who tried to swim to the surface. Warehouses were burned, merchant stalls plundered, and the surrounding agricultural villages systematically torched, wiping out the accumulated commercial wealth of generations. While contemporary chroniclers inflated the death toll into the tens of thousands, modern historians agree that the massacre permanently broke the economic spine and demographic vitality of the northern metropolis. Having thoroughly desolated Novgorod, Ivan marched on to the city of Pskov, sparing it only after a revered holy fool named Nikola Salos offered the trembling Tsar a piece of raw meat during Great Lent, warning him of eternal damnation. While Ivan was busy butchering his own subjects and shattering his domestic economy, the external defenses of the realm fell into a state of total collapse. In May 1571, Khan Devlet Jiri of the Crimean Tatars exploited the internal chaos and marched an army of 120,000 horsemen directly to the outskirts of Moscow. The Oprychnina regiments, completely ineffective against a real military adversary, disintegrated in panic and refused to fight, allowing the Tatars to set fire to the wooden suburbs of the capital. A ferocious firestorm engulfed the entire city within 3 hours, suffocating tens of thousands of residents and cellars and reducing the glorious stone churches to smoking ruins. Humiliated and realizing that his personal terror brigade had nearly destroyed the state, Ivan dissolved the Oprychnina in 1572 and forbade anyone from speaking its name under pain of death. That same summer, a united Russian army commanded by the brilliant Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky smashed the returning Crimean horde at the epic Battle of Molody, saving Muscovy from total conquest only for Ivan to have Vorotinsky tortured to death on suspicion of treason shortly thereafter. The catastrophic Livonian War finally ended in total exhaustion and defeat between 1582 and 1583, forcing Ivan to sign humiliating peace treaties with Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Muscovy surrendered all its Baltic conquests, lost vital coastal fortresses along the Gulf of Finland, and emerged from 25 years of grinding warfare economically bankrupt and depopulated. The only unexpected bright spot in this dark era came from the eastern frontier, where the wealthy Stroganov merchant family financed an expedition of Don Cossacks commanded by the daring Ataman Yermak Timofeyevich. In 1582, Yermak's small band of musketeers swept across the Ural Mountains, smashed the cavalry of Khan Kukum, and captured the fortress of Kashlik, claiming the vast, fur-rich expanse of Siberia for the Tsar. Yet this geopolitical windfall could not heal the tragic wound Ivan inflicted upon his own bloodline in a fit of uncontrollable rage in November 1581. Accusing his pregnant daughter-in-law of wearing improper dress, Ivan flew into a fury, and when his capable, beloved eldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, stepped in to defend her, the Tsar struck the young prince in the temple with his iron-tipped staff, fatally wounding him. Overcome with immediate horror and grief, Ivan wept over his dying heir for days, knowing that he had extinguished his only capable successor and condemned his dynasty to eventual extinction. In March 1584, swollen with disease and tormented by the phantoms of his countless victims, Ivan IV collapsed over a chessboard and died at the age of 53. The throne passed to his only surviving son, 27-year-old Fyodor I, a gentle, sickly, and intellectually disabled man who spent his days ringing church bells and praying before holy icons. Because Fyodor was entirely incapable of governing a sprawling empire, a council of regents was formed, from which the Tsar's ambitious brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, swiftly emerged as the de facto ruler of the state. Godunov was a brilliant, calculating administrator who worked tirelessly to heal the deep wounds left by Ivan's reign, stabilizing the state budget and securing the formal recognition of the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate in 1589. Yet Godunov's position was haunted by the existence of Ivan's youngest son, the 8-year-old Tsarevich Dmitry, who lived in provincial exile at Uglich with his mother, Maria Nagaya. In May 1591, news reached Moscow that young Dmitry had been found dead in the palace courtyard with his throat slashed, sparking widespread rumors that Godunov had orchestrated the boy's murder to clear his own path to the throne. An official investigative commission led by Prince Vasily Shuisky hastily concluded that Dmitry had accidentally severed his own carotid artery during an epileptic seizure while playing with a knife. This improbable verdict satisfied few, and the suspicion of dynastic regicide clung to Boris Godunov for the rest of his life, like a poisoned shroud. When Tsar Fyodor died childless in January 1598, the 700-year-old Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled since the days of Rurik and Saint Vladimir, came to an absolute and permanent end. In the immense vacuum left by the extinct dynasty, the Zemsky Sobor convened and elected Boris Godunov as the new Tsar of Russia. Boris was crowned in a lavish ceremony, promising to rule with justice, eradicate poverty, and shower his subjects with royal benevolence. He sent promising young noblemen to study in Western Europe, encouraged foreign trade, and built magnificent stone fortresses along the vulnerable southern frontier. Yet to the deeply religious and traditional Russian people, Boris lacked the sacred, hereditary aura of royal blood. He was merely an elected boyar whose elevation felt to many like an unnatural violation of divine order. In the late summer of 1601, catastrophic volcanic eruptions on the other side of the globe triggered a sudden, severe climatic downturn across the northern hemisphere. Freezing rains poured over the Russian heartland throughout the summer, followed by early autumn frosts that completely destroyed the unripened rye and wheat harvests. For 3 consecutive years, from 1601 to 1603, the crops failed utterly, plunging the empire into the most devastating famine in its recorded history. Starving peasants ate grass, tree bark, and leather harnesses, while contemporary chronicles recorded widespread instances of cannibalism and corpses littering the roads with mouths stuffed with straw. In Moscow alone, more than 120,000 bodies were buried in mass graves, as up to a third of the empire's entire population perished from hunger and epidemic typhus. Landlords cast their unfree serfs and domestic retainers out into the snow to avoid feeding them, creating roving bands of desperate, armed outlaws who plundered merchant caravans and noble estates. In the superstitious minds of the desperate masses, this apocalyptic disaster was clear proof that God was punishing Russia for crowning a regicide usurper, setting the stage for the complete unraveling of the social order. In 1603, amidst this swirling vortex of famine and religious dread, an astonishing rumor spread through the markets and tavern stalls. Tsarevich Dmitry had not died at Uglich after all, but had been miraculously saved by faithful servants. The young man claiming this royal identity was almost certainly Grigory Otrepyev, a runaway monk from the Chudov monastery who had fled across the border into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The pretender converted to Roman Catholicism in secret, gained the enthusiastic backing of powerful Polish magnates like Jerzy Nisik, and secured a private audience with King Sigismund III. Promising to hand over border territories and convert Russia to the Catholic faith, the charismatic young man gathered an army of Polish adventurers, Zaporozhian Cossacks, and desperate Russian exiles. In the autumn of 1604, this first false Dmitry crossed the southwestern frontier of Muscovy, marching under royal banners bearing the double-headed eagle and the image of St. George. Town after town opened their gates to him without a fight, as peasants, Cossacks, and provincial garrisons enthusiastically rallied to the man they believed was their true, divinely protected sovereign. Tsar Boris mobilized the royal army to confront the invader, winning initial tactical victories, but his generals and soldiers had no stomach to fight against the supposed legitimate heir. In April 1605, worn down by stress, fear, and failing health, Boris Godunov died suddenly in the Kremlin, leaving his brilliant 16-year-old son Fyodor II to hold the collapsing throne. Within weeks, the imperial army on the southern front defected en masse to the pretender, while a mob of angry citizens stormed the Kremlin and strangled young Fyodor and his mother in their private quarters. In June 1605, the false Dmitri entered Moscow in magnificent triumph, greeted by weeping crowds who fell to their knees in the dust to welcome their resurrected Tsar. To seal his legitimacy, the Dowager Tsaritsa Maria Nagaya was brought from her convent and publicly embraced the young man as her long-lost son, knowing that her survival depended on maintaining the charade. Dmitri was formally crowned in the Dormition Cathedral, showing himself to be an energetic, intelligent, and surprisingly merciful ruler who abolished taxes in famine-stricken regions and listened directly to peasant petitions. Yet the new Tsar quickly alienated the traditional boyar elite and the Orthodox clergy by refusing to take afternoon naps, riding fiery stallions through the streets, and surrounding himself with Polish Catholic advisors who openly mocked Russian customs. The breaking point arrived in May 1606, when Dmitri celebrated his lavish wedding to the Polish noblewoman Marina Nisik according to Catholic and Western customs, filling the Holy Kremlin with drunken foreign soldiers. Seizing the moment of popular outrage, the cunning boyar Prince Vasily Shuisky organized a lightning conspiracy among the palace guards and urban militia. On the morning of May 17th, church bells rang out the alarm across Moscow, and an armed mob stormed the royal palace, while the pretender tried desperately to escape by leaping from a high window into the courtyard. Dmitri broke his leg in the fall, was dragged inside by palace guards, and was ruthlessly shot and hacked to death by boyar conspirators. His mutilated corpse was displayed in Red Square with a clown mask placed upon his chest before being burned to ashes, stuffed into a great cannon, and fired back toward the west from whence he had come. Prince Vasily Shuisky immediately proclaimed himself Tsar Vasily IV, but his authority rested on nothing more than the narrow consensus of a few powerful boyar families, leaving him entirely powerless to stop the spreading anarchy. Shuisky's illegitimate coronation ignited a wildfire of rebellions across the southern and eastern borderlands, where the masses refused to accept that their beloved Dmitri was dead a second time. A former runaway slave and galley captive named Ivan Bolotnikov mobilized a massive army of serfs, Cossacks, and impoverished gentry under the banner of social revolution. Bolotnikov's insurgent army marched all the way to the walls of Moscow, demanding the extermination of the boyar class and the total redistribution of aristocratic lands to the poor. Although Shuisky managed to crush the Bolotnikov rebellion after a brutal siege at Tula, an even more absurd and dangerous threat materialized in 1607 with the appearance of a second false Dmitri. This new impostor, whose true identity remains an enigma to this day, established a massive armed encampment at the village of Tishino just outside Moscow, earning the nickname the Thief of Tishino. Marina Nisik, desperate to regain her imperial status, traveled to the camp and publicly recognized this rough, uneducated stranger as her miraculously rescued husband. For 2 chaotic years, Russia was paralyzed by having 2 competing tsars, 2 rival boyar councils, and 2 separate patriarchs, while roaming bands of Polish mercenaries and Cossack brigands systematically looted the defenseless countryside. In a desperate bid to clear the Tishino camp, Tsar Vasily Shuisky signed an alliance with Sweden in 1609, surrendering Baltic territories in exchange for mercenary troops. This move gave King Sigismund III of Poland the perfect pretext to declare open war on Russia, marching a royal army across the border and laying siege to the mighty fortress of Smolensk. In June 1610, at the Battle of Klashino, a small force of elite Polish winged hussars routed a vastly superior combined Russian and Swedish army, exposing Moscow to immediate capture. Panicked boyars in the capital staged a coup, deposed the hated Vasily Shuisky, forcibly sheared him into a monk, and established an emergency junta of 7 prominent nobles known as the 7 Boyars. To save their own lives and estates, the 7 Boyars committed the ultimate act of treason. They invited the Polish king's son, Prince Władysław, to take the Russian throne and open the Kremlin gates to Polish garrison troops. For the first time in history, the sacred citadel of Muscovy was occupied by Catholic foreign soldiers, while Smolensk fell after a heroic 20-month siege and Swedish troops seized the northern stronghold of Novgorod. The Russian state had completely dissolved into smoking fragments, its sovereign throne usurped, its treasuries plundered, and its ancestral lands divided between rapacious foreign conquerors. from his cold, damp dungeon cell beneath the Chudov Monastery, where he was slowly being starved to death by the Polish garrison. The 80-year-old Patriarch Hermogenes managed to smuggle out secret letters to every corner of the realm. Hermogenes called upon all Orthodox Christians to rise above their petty regional feuds, unite in defense of the ancestral faith, and march upon Moscow to cleanse the holy shrines of foreign desecration. The dying patriarch's words ignited a profound grassroots awakening in the commercial Volga city of Nizhny Novgorod in the autumn of 1611. A wealthy meat merchant named Kuzma Minin stepped before the town assembly and urged the citizens to pledge their money, their household goods, and their very lives to raise a national volunteer army. The military leadership of this second volunteer host was entrusted to Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, an honest and experienced commander who had shed his blood fighting the invaders and possessed no ties to corrupt court factions. This extraordinary alliance between a humble merchant and a wounded prince united provincial gentry, urban artisans, Streltsy musketeers, and Volga Cossacks in a disciplined crusade to liberate the motherland. In the late summer of 1612, the volunteer army under Minin and Pozharsky arrived outside the blackened ruins of Moscow, carrying the miraculous icon of Our Lady of Kazan at the head of their columns. A formidable Polish relief army commanded by Grand Hetman Jan Karol Chodkiewicz launched a desperate armored assault to break through the Russian lines and resupply the starving Kremlin garrison. In a series of savage, bloody street battles among the ruined timber foundations of the capital, the Russian volunteers and Cossacks threw back repeated cavalry charges and broke the relief force. Cut off from all supplies, the Polish garrison inside the Kremlin descended into horrific cannibalism, boiling parchment manuscripts and eating the corpses of their own dead comrades. On October 22, 1612, the Russian forces stormed the Kitay-Gorod quarter, and 5 days later, the starving Polish garrison formally surrendered, marching out of the Kremlin gates under Russian guard. Prince Pozharsky and Kuzma Minin led their weeping, victorious army through the Spasskaya Tower into the devastated Kremlin, falling to their knees in the Dormition Cathedral to give thanks for the miraculous salvation of the Russian land. The time of troubles had brought the state to the very brink of utter annihilation, proving that the endurance of the nation rested not merely on the whims of autocrats, but on the stubborn resilience of its people. In January 1613, the most representative Zemsky Sobor in Russian history convened in the liberated capital to resolve the single question that would determine the survival of the realm: who should wear the imperial crown? Delegates arrived from every province and estate, including boyars, provincial service gentry, high clergy, merchants, townspeople, and, for the first time, free peasant elders and Cossacks. After weeks of heated debates and the rejection of foreign princes and ambitious boyar candidates, the assembly reached a pragmatic consensus on the person of 16-year-old Michael Romanov. Michael possessed an impeccable ancestral lineage. His great-aunt was the revered Tsaritsa Anastasia, Ivan the Terrible's beloved first wife, and his father was the highly respected Patriarch Filaret, who was then languishing as a captive in Poland. Furthermore, the young boy was free from the bloody factional intrigues of the time of troubles, offering the exhausted nation a clean slate and a living bridge between the ancient Rurikid past and an uncertain future. A solemn delegation was dispatched to the Ipatiev monastery near Kostroma, where they found Michael and his mother sheltering behind stone walls, tearfully convincing the reluctant youth to accept the crushing burden of the throne. On July 11, 1613, Michael Romanov was crowned Tsar in the Dormition Cathedral, establishing the Romanov dynasty that would guide the Russian Empire from the ashes of medieval ruin to the pinnacle of global power for the next 300 years. When 16-year-old Michael Romanov ascended the consecrated throne in 1613, he looked out upon a realm that was economically paralyzed, geographically amputated, and haunted by roving bands of armed brigands. The state treasury in the Kremlin was so thoroughly stripped that royal couriers had to borrow private funds merely to purchase wax for official seals. To the west, the victorious armies of Sweden held the entire Gulf of Finland and the ancient trading cradle of Novgorod, while Polish garrisons remained entrenched within striking distance of the capital. Through excruciating diplomatic negotiations, the The young Tsar concluded the Treaty of Stalbovo with Sweden in 1617, regaining Novgorod at the bitter cost of surrendering all access to the Baltic Sea. The following year, the Truce of Delino ended active hostilities with Poland-Lithuania, yielding the strategic frontier fortress of Smolensk in exchange for a temporary 14-year peace. Crucially, this Polish accord secured the release of the Tsar's father, Metropolitan Filaret, who returned to Moscow in 1619 to be enthroned as the new Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Filaret was a formidable, iron-willed statesman whose administrative acumen far surpassed that of his gentle, pious son. For the next 14 years, Russia was ruled by an extraordinary political diarchy, with father and son sharing the supreme title of Great Sovereign and issuing joint imperial decrees. Filaret immediately set about reconstructing the shattered fiscal apparatus, ordering nationwide land surveys to register surviving households and stabilize taxable revenues. The central government reorganized the old chanceries, known as prikazy, into a disciplined bureaucratic network capable of managing diplomacy, artillery manufacture, and judicial appeals from the Kremlin. Recognizing the military obsolescence of the traditional boyar cavalry, the crown hired foreign officers from Germany, Scotland, and the Netherlands to train new Western-style infantry and cavalry regiments. When Filaret died in 1633, followed by Tsar Michael in 1645, the battered Muscovite state had miraculously survived its mortal wounds and stood ready to reassert its sovereign authority. The crown passed peacefully to Michael's 16-year-old son, Alexis I, who would enter history with the deceptive moniker of the quietest Tsar. Beneath Alexis's devout, monastic daily routine lay an uncompromising autocrat dedicated to expanding the sacred power of his throne and imposing rigid social order across the empire. The young Tsar's reign was immediately tested in the summer of 1648 by the explosive Salt Riot, triggered by exorbitant tax increases on basic dietary necessities. An enraged mob of artisans, merchants, and mutinous musketeers stormed the Kremlin, dragging corrupt ministers into the cobblestone squares and beating them to death before the eyes of the royal court. Terrified for his own survival, Alexis was forced to sacrifice his most hated financial advisors to the crowd while distributing lavish gifts and back pay to pacify the rebellious Streltsy garrison. To permanently restore public order and address the grievances of the provincial service gentry, the Tsar convened a Grand Zemsky Sobor to systematically codify the entire body of Russian law. The result of these deliberations was the monumental Sobornoye Yelazny of 1649, a comprehensive legal code inscribed upon a scroll of parchment nearly 1,000 feet in length. This historic document fundamentally reshaped the social fabric of Russia by locking every estate into a rigid, hereditary caste system designed to serve the fiscal needs of the state. Most consequentially, the code completely abolished the statute of limitations on hunting down runaway peasants, granting noble landlords the absolute right to reclaim fugitives regardless of how many years had passed. With this single stroke of the quill, millions of previously free or semi-dependent agricultural laborers were legally bound to the land forever, transforming serfdom into the defining bedrock of the empire. The urban populations were similarly frozen in place, forbidding merchants and artisans from leaving their municipal communities to prevent any erosion of the local tax base. In exchange for their unconditional military service to the Tsar, the noble gentry were granted total judicial and economic ownership over the bodies, labor, and families living upon their estates. No sooner had the social order been frozen into legal stone than an apocalyptic spiritual crisis tore the Russian Orthodox Church into irreconcilable halves. In 1652, the ambitious and domineering Patriarch Nikon was elevated to the patriarchal throne, determined to establish the supremacy of spiritual authority over the secular crown. Nikon observed that centuries of manuscript copying had introduced minor textual errors and ritual variations between Russian liturgical books and the ancient Greek Orthodox originals. With the enthusiastic backing of Tsar Alexis, Nikon mandated sweeping corrections, requiring the sign of the cross to be made with 3 fingers instead of 2 and standardizing the spelling of Jesus' name. To the deeply conservative Russian populace, These changes were not trivial grammatical corrections, but a sacrilegious assault on the ancestral faith that threatened the eternal salvation of their souls. Millions of devout believers rejected the revisions outright, believing that the official church had fallen into catastrophic heresy and that the final reign of the Antichrist had commenced. This seismic rupture gave birth to the Old Believers movement, igniting the tragic phenomenon known to history as the Raskol or the Great Russian Church Schism. The spiritual champion of the Old Believers was the fiery, unyielding archpriest of Vakicum, whose passionate sermons and autobiographical writings inspired widespread resistance against both church and crown. Avakicum fiercely declared that he would rather die 1,000 agonizing deaths than abandon the two-fingered sign of the cross sanctified by the ancient saints. The state responded with merciless brutality, stripping dissenting clergy of their holy orders, severing their tongues, and exiling thousands of Old Believer families to the frozen wastes of the Arctic. For 8 heroic years, the monks of the formidable Solovetsky Monastery on the White Sea withstood a brutal military siege by royal troops rather than accept the reformed liturgical service books. When the monastery finally fell through internal betrayal in 1676, the imperial commanders subjected the surviving monks to gruesome executions, hanging them from timber gallows by their heels. In 1682, after 14 years of solitary confinement in an underground pit in Pustozyorsk, Archpriest Avakicum was burned at the stake, blessing the weeping crowds with 2 defiant fingers as the flames consumed him. While religious discord divided the heartland, a geopolitical earthquake on the southwestern steppe frontier pulled the Muscovite state into a monumental clash with Poland-Lithuania. In 1648, the Zaporozhian Cossacks erupted in a massive anti-Polish uprising led by their charismatic and battle-hardened hetman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Trapped between Polish counteroffensives and the shifting loyalties of Crimean Tatar allies, Khmelnytsky turned to Orthodox Moscow for military protection. In January 1654, at the historic Pereyaslav Rada, the Cossack leadership took a solemn oath of eternal allegiance to Tsar Alexis, uniting the Cossack hetmanate with the Russian crown. This union ignited the protracted 13 years war between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, contesting mastery over the borderlands of Ukraine and Belarus. By the Truce of Andrusovo in 1667, Russia reclaimed the long-lost fortress of Smolensk and annexed all of left bank Ukraine, along with the sacred mother city of Kiev on the right bank of the Dnieper. The immense financial strain of these endless military campaigns forced the crown to debase the currency, issuing millions of unbacked copper coins that triggered rampant inflation and the violent copper riot of 1662. Deep social unrest reached a boiling point on the southern frontier, where runaway serfs, destitute boatmen, and unruly Don Cossacks gathered in search of freedom and plunder. In 1670, a magnetic Cossack warlord named Stenka Razin raised the standard of open rebellion, promising to exterminate all treacherous boyars and bring absolute liberty to the common folk. Razin's rebel fleet seized the Volga trade corridor, capturing the major fortress cities of Tsaritsyn, Astrakhan, and Samara, while slaughtering royal governors and distributing captured wealth to the cheering poor. Terrified noblemen watched in horror as peasant revolts erupted across the Volga basin, threatening to overwhelm the central authority of the state in a wave of agrarian violence. The rebellion was finally broken outside the walls of Simbirsk by disciplined, foreign-trained imperial regiments, leading to Razin's capture, torture, and quartering alive in Red Square in June 1671. Even as the state suppressed internal revolts, Russian explorers, Cossacks, and fur trappers were executing one of the most breathtaking imperial expansions in human history across the frozen wastes of Siberia. Traveling along interconnected river networks in shallow timber riverboats, these hardy pioneers established fortified stockades known as ostrogs at strategic junctions like Tomsk, Yeniseisk, and Yakutsk. The primary engine of this eastward drive was the pursuit of soft gold, the luxurious pelts of sables, foxes, and otters extracted from indigenous tribes through the compulsory tribute system known as yasak. In 1648, an intrepid Cossack navigator named Semyon Dezhnyov sailed through the icy strait separating Asia from North America, discovering the Bering Strait 80 years before Vitus Bering. Russian expeditions under Vasily Poyarkov and Yerofy Khabarov pushed south into the fertile Amur River basin, coming into direct armed conflict with the frontier outposts of the Qing Empire of China. Realizing the impossibility of sustaining a major military conflict across thousands of miles of wilderness, Moscow concluded the Treaty of Nerchinsk with the Kangxi Emperor in 1689, fixing the Sino-Russian border and securing lucrative caravan trade routes. When Tsar Alexis died in 1676, the imperial succession was thrown into dangerous disarray by the competing claims of his two distinct family lines. Alexis had fathered several children with his first wife, Maria Miloslavskaya, including the sickly new Tsar Fyodor III, his intellectually disabled brother Ivan, and the fiercely intelligent Tsarevna Sofia. From his second marriage to Natalia Naryshkina, the late Tsar had produced a single, exceptionally vigorous, and hyperactive son named Peter, born in June 1672. Fyodor III's brief six-year reign was marked by a crucial modernization: the formal abolition of mesnachestvo, the archaic aristocratic system that had determined military and court appointments based strictly on ancestral lineage rather than merit. When Fyodor died without an heir in April 1682, the Patriarch and the Boyar Council bypassed the frail, half-blind Ivan and proclaimed the 10-year-old Peter as the new sovereign. This decision provoked the furious wrath of the Miloslavsky clan, who immediately conspired to use the volatile Streltsy musketeers to overturn the succession through armed violence. In May 1682, rumors swept the Streltsy barracks that the Naryshkins had smothered the young Prince Ivan in his bed to secure undisputed power for Peter. Driven into a frenzy of drunken rage, thousands of armed Streltsy marched on the Kremlin, storming the sacred Red Staircase where the Dowager Tsaritsa stood holding both young princes alive and unharmed. Unmoved by the sight of the living heirs, the musketeers went on a 3-day murderous rampage through the palace corridors, hunting down the Naryshkin family and their prominent supporters. Young Peter stood frozen on the balcony, watching his beloved uncles and guardians dragged from their hiding spots and impaled on upraised pikes in the courtyard below. This traumatic nightmare burned itself permanently into the 10-year-old boy's psyche, forging a lifelong hatred for traditional Muscovite conservatism and an enduring obsession with absolute military discipline. To appease the victorious musketeers, a bizarre political compromise was arranged. Ivan V was crowned as the senior Tsar, Peter I as the junior Tsar, and their ambitious 25-year-old sister Sofia was installed as regent. Tsarevna Sofia ruled the realm for 7 years with the aid of her cultured, Western-leaning favorite and chief minister, Prince Vasily Golitsyn. Sofia consolidated the empire's western borders by concluding the Eternal Peace of 1686 with Poland, confirming Russia's permanent possession of Kiev and left bank Ukraine. However, Golitsyn's ambitious military campaigns against the Crimean Khanate in 1687 and 1689 ended in logistical catastrophes, leaving thousands of Russian soldiers dead in the burning steppe without ever engaging the main enemy forces. Meanwhile, the towering young Peter was largely ignored by the regency, living in semi-exile at the royal village of Preobrazhenskoye outside Moscow. There, the energetic youth formed his famous toy regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky Guards, recruiting boys of all social classes to drill with real weapons, modern cannons, and European tactics. Peter spent his free time wandering the nearby German quarter, absorbing Western ideas, drinking with Dutch sea captains, and mastering the practical crafts of carpentry, blacksmithing, and navigation. On the waters of Lake Pleshchivo, he discovered an old, rotting English sailboat in a barn, repairing it with the help of Dutch shipwrights and christening it the grandfather of the Russian Navy. In the late summer of 1689, the smoldering power struggle between the 17-year-old Peter and the regent Sofia erupted into a decisive showdown. Warned of an alleged plot by the Streltsy to assassinate him, Peter fled in the middle of the night to the fortified walls of the Trinity Sergius Lavra. To Sophia's utter horror, the elite foreign-trained regiments, the high clergy, and the foreign officers of the German quarter abandoned the Kremlin and rallied to Peter's side. Isolated and stripped of her political support, Sophia was forced to surrender, stripped of all authority, and permanently confined within the walls of the Novodevichy convent in Moscow. Peter allowed his gentle co-czar Ivan V to handle ceremonial and religious duties until Ivan's quiet death in 1696, leaving Peter as the sole, absolute master of the Russian world. Standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall, possessed of demonic energy and an insatiable curiosity, the young autocrat was determined to drag his isolated, landlocked empire into the modern maritime age by sheer force of will. Peter's first major military test came in 1695, when he launched an expedition south to seize the formidable Ottoman fortress of Azov on the Black Sea. The initial siege failed miserably because the Russian army lacked a navy to cut off the fortress from Turkish maritime resupply lines. Undeterred by defeat, Peter mobilized tens of thousands of workers at the inland shipyards of Voronezh, constructing an entire war fleet of galleys and fireships in less than 5 months. Returning to Azov in the spring of 1696 with his brand new fleet, Peter completely blockaded the fortress from the sea, forcing the Turkish garrison to surrender in a stunning military triumph. To secure European allies against the Ottoman Empire and master modern Western technology, Peter launched the unprecedented Grand Embassy in 1697, traveling across Western Europe incognito under the pseudonym of Peter Mikhailov. For 18 extraordinary months, the Russian sovereign worked with his own hands as a common shipwright in Dutch and English yards, studied anatomy in Leiden, inspected artillery at Woolwich, and attended sessions of the English Parliament. While in Europe, Peter recruited hundreds of Western naval captains, military engineers, mathematicians, and physicians to enter Russian state service. His grand diplomatic tour was abruptly cut short in the summer of 1698 by terrifying news from home. The Streltsy regiments had mutinied once again, marching on Moscow to restore Sofia to the throne. Although loyal royal forces commanded by General Patrick Gordon crushed the rebels before Peter's return, the Tsar was determined to extinguish this domestic threat forever. Arriving in Moscow consumed by cold fury, Peter personally participated in the interrogation, horrific torture, and public execution of more than 1,000 Streltsy musketeers. The severed corpses of the rebels were left hanging from the Kremlin walls for months, with 3 executed musketeers strung up directly outside Sofia's convent window, holding their written treasonous petitions in their frozen hands. The ancient Streltsy Corps was permanently abolished, their families exiled, and their houses razed to the ground, ending the era of palace mutinies and clearing the path for an absolute, unchallenged autocracy. Immediately following the suppression of the rebellion, Peter launched a cultural revolution designed to violently sever Russia from its medieval Muscovite traditions. At a gathering of high boyars the morning after his return, the Tsar produced a pair of barber's shears and began personally hacking off the long, sacred beards of his horrified aristocrats. Decrees were swiftly issued ordering all nobles, merchants, and officials to shave their faces or pay a crippling annual beard tax, carrying a bronze token inscribed with the words, "Tax paid." The flowing robes and caftans of traditional Muscovy were outlawed, replaced by compulsory Western European coats, breeches, and tricorn hats. Peter overhauled the ancient calendar, which had previously counted years from the biblical creation of the world, commanding that January 1st, 1700, be celebrated as the new year in accordance with European practice. Upper-class women, who had spent centuries sequestered away in the dark domestic quarters known as the Tarim, were ordered to attend co-ed public assemblies, wear European corsets, and participate in social dancing. With his domestic control solidified, Peter turned his strategic gaze toward the Baltic Sea, determined to secure a maritime window to Western Europe. In the autumn of 1700, after concluding a formal alliance with Denmark and Poland Saxony, Peter declared war on Sweden, igniting the epic 21-year Great Northern War. The opening clash was an absolute disaster for Russia. At the Battle of Narva in November 1700, the 18-year-old Swedish king Charles XII led an army of 10,000 through a blinding blizzard and utterly shattered a Russian force 4 times its size. The entire Russian artillery train was captured, its foreign officers surrendered, and the Swedish king dismissed Peter's army as an undisciplined peasant rabble unworthy of further attention. Rather than succumbing to despair, Peter reacted with superhuman resolve, ordering church bells across the empire torn down from their belfries and melted into hundreds of new bronze cannons. He instituted lifelong conscription for the peasantry, built modern arms factories and iron foundries in the Ural Mountains, and thoroughly restructured the army along Western tactical doctrines. While King Charles XII was bogged down fighting in Poland, Peter pushed his reorganized forces into the Swedish-held marshlands along the Neva River. On May 27, 1703, on the waterlogged island of Zyaki near the Gulf of Finland, Peter laid the foundation stone for the Peter and Paul Fortress, christening the new city St. Petersburg. This audacious new capital was envisioned as a modern, stone-built maritime metropolis, designed with straight boulevards, intersecting canals, and neoclassical facades that turned its back completely on ancient Moscow. The construction of the city was a monumental humanitarian nightmare, built upon desolate swamps where tens of thousands of conscripted peasants, soldiers, and Swedish prisoners of war perished from malaria, dysentery, and freezing exhaustion. Every cart and boat entering the growing city was legally required to deliver a quota of heavy stones to be used for paving roads and building canal embankments. By 1712, despite continuous Swedish military threats and the grumbling of traditionalist nobles who called it a city built on bones, St. Petersburg was proclaimed the official capital of the Russian Empire. In 1708, King Charles XII launched a massive invasion of the Russian heartland with an elite army of 44,000 veterans, openly boasting that he would dictate peace terms from the Kremlin. Peter adopted a ruthless strategy of scorched earth retreat, burning crops, destroying flour mills, and poisoning wells along the Swedish line of advance. At the Battle of Lesnaya in the autumn of 1708, Russian forces intercepted and destroyed a Swedish relief column under General Lewenhaupt, capturing its entire supply train of ammunition and food. Facing starvation, Charles was forced to abandon his march on Moscow and turn south toward Ukraine, hoping to winter his exhausted troops and join forces with the rebellious Cossack hetman Ivan Mazepa. The winter of 1708 to 1709 proved to be the coldest in European memory, freezing birds in mid-flight and killing thousands of Swedish soldiers in their uninsulated camps across the open steppe. When spring finally arrived, the once invincible Swedish army was reduced to a desperate, freezing remnant, lacking heavy siege artillery, gunpowder, and fresh supplies. On June 27, 1709, the two armies met in a decisive clash outside the besieged Ukrainian fortress city of Poltava. Peter personally led his troops in the center of the line, taking a Swedish musket ball through his tricorn hat, while Charles XII, incapacitated by a severe foot wound, was carried into battle upon a litter. The disciplined Russian infantry and overwhelming artillery barrage completely shattered the Swedish assault within 2 hours of ferocious combat. The Swedish army disintegrated in total panic, with more than 9,000 soldiers killed on the field and the remaining 16,000 surrendering unconditionally on the banks of the Dnieper. King Charles and Hetman Mazepa barely escaped capture, fleeing across the southern frontier to seek sanctuary inside the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Poltava was a monumental turning point in world history, permanently ending Sweden's era as a great power and announcing to a stunned Europe that Russia was now the dominant military colossus of the North. To administer his rapidly expanding and modernized realm, Peter swept away the chaotic, overlapping medieval pricacy and introduced a rationalized bureaucratic structure based on Swedish and German models. In 1711, he created the Governing Senate, a supreme collegiate body of 9 trusted officials tasked with governing the empire during the Tsar's frequent military absences. The central administration was divided into specialized collegia, or ministries, each governed collectively by a council to manage foreign affairs, the navy, war, state revenue, and manufacturing. In 1722, Peter promulgated the Revolutionary Table of Ranks, which divided all military, naval, and civil state service into 14 strictly ordered, parallel grades. Under this system, noble birth alone no longer guaranteed high military or administrative office. Every nobleman was required to start at the absolute bottom rank and earn promotion through demonstrated skill and lifelong service. Any commoner who managed to rise to the 8th civil rank or 14th military rank was automatically awarded hereditary nobility, infusing the ruling class with fresh talent and binding the entire elite directly to the imperial state. Peter's drive for total bureaucratic control reached into the sacred heart of the Russian Orthodox Church, which he viewed as a dangerous hotbed of medieval superstition and political subversion. When Patriarch Adrian died in 1700, Peter deliberately refused to allow the election of a successor, appointing an interim administrator to manage church affairs for the next 2 decades. In 1721, guided by the intellectual clergyman Feofan Prokopovich, the Tsar published the Spiritual Regulation, formally and permanently abolishing the office of the Patriarchate. In its place, he established the Most Holy Synod, a collegiate administrative board of bishops overseen by an appointed secular military officer known as the Chief Procurator. Priests were legally mandated to violate the sacred seal of the confessional, requiring them to report any confessions of anti-state treason or sedition directly to the secret police. The Russian Orthodox Church was stripped of its ancient independence, thoroughly subjugated to the secular autocracy, and transformed into an official department of state. The gargantuan costs of perpetual warfare, naval construction, and administrative modernization forced Peter to completely overhaul the imperial tax system. In 1718, the state replaced the old, easily manipulated household tax with the soul tax, an inflexible head tax assessed directly upon every individual male peasant and urban commoner in the empire. To enforce collection, the government conducted massive empire-wide censuses and introduced internal passports, forbidding peasants from traveling more than 30 versts from their villages without written permission. Yet the most agonizing tragedy of Peter's reign unfolded within his own immediate family, centered upon his timid, deeply religious eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei loathed his father's violent westernizing reforms, surrounding himself with conservative boyars and fleeing to Austria in 1716 to seek political protection from the Holy Roman Emperor. Lured back to St. Petersburg under false promises of forgiveness, Alexei was arrested, stripped of his right of succession, and subjected to brutal interrogations and torture inside the Peter and Paul fortress. In June 1718, after being condemned to death for high treason by a court of imperial officials, the 28-year-old Tsarevich died in his dungeon cell from the horrific injuries inflicted by the knout, almost certainly with his father's direct complicity. The grueling Great Northern War finally concluded in August 1721 with the signing of the historic Treaty of Nystad between Russia and Sweden. By the terms of the treaty, Russia gained permanent, undisputed possession of the strategic Baltic provinces of Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and parts of southern Karelia, firmly securing its coveted maritime gateway to Europe. In October 1721, amidst euphoric celebrations in the new stone churches of St. Petersburg, the governing Senate and Holy Synod presented Peter with the titles of Father of the Fatherland, Peter the Great, and Emperor of all Russia. The ancient Grand Principality of Muscovy was now formally and officially renamed the Russian Empire, taking its rightful place among the great imperial monarchies of the modern world. In less than a quarter of a century, Peter had forged an ocean-going battle fleet from nothing, constructed an invincible standing army of 200,000 soldiers, and established thriving metallurgical and textile industries. Yet this astonishing modern empire rested upon an unimaginably brutal foundation of total social subjugation, crushing taxation, and an intensified system of serfdom that treated the vast majority of the population as expendable state property. Having executed his only legitimate son and heir, Peter issued a radical new law of succession in 1722, revoking the ancient custom of hereditary primogeniture. The new decree granted the reigning emperor the absolute, arbitrary right to designate any person of his choosing as his successor to the throne. In the late autumn of 1724, while inspecting military works along the Gulf of Finland, the 52-year-old emperor saw a boatload of soldiers and sailors stranded on a sandbar in freezing, storm-tossed waters. Without hesitation, Peter plunged waist-deep into the icy surf to assist in the rescue operation, triggering a severe chill that rapidly degenerated into a lethal bladder and kidney infection. In January 1725, writhing in unbearable agony upon his deathbed in the Winter Palace, the dying emperor feebly called for a sheet of paper and began to write his final testament. His trembling hand managed to scrawl only two ambiguous words, "Give all," before the pen slipped from his frozen fingers, plunging the newly born Russian Empire into an era of violent palace coups and dynastic uncertainty. The bomb that killed Alexander II on March 1st, 1881, did more than shatter the body of the Tsar Liberator. It shattered the fragile possibility that Russia might evolve peacefully into a constitutional monarchy. His son Alexander III, a towering, bearded giant of a man who could bend iron horseshoes with his bare hands, drew from his father's murder a single, unshakable conviction. Reform was not a safety valve, but a death trap. Where Alexander II had cautiously opened windows to let in fresh air, Alexander III slammed every shutter shut and bolted the doors. He dismissed his father's liberal ministers, restored the absolute supremacy of the autocratic will, and placed the entire empire under the suffocating surveillance of the Okhrana secret police. Universities were purged of independent thought, the Zemstvo councils were stripped of their limited powers, and non-Russian minorities from the Baltic provinces to the Caucasus faced an aggressive campaign of forced Russification that banned local languages from schools and government offices. Yet paradoxically, while Alexander III froze the political life of the nation, he unleashed its economic engine with unprecedented ferocity. Under the guidance of his brilliant finance minister Sergei Witt, the empire embarked on a crash program of state-directed industrialization that transformed Russia from an agrarian backwater into one of the world's fastest-growing industrial economies. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the longest continuous rail line on the planet, began stretching its iron tendrils across the vast wilderness from Moscow to Vladivostok, binding the Pacific coast to the European heartland. Coal production in the Donbass region exploded, oil derricks multiplied across the Caspian shores of Baku, and the smokestacks of new steel mills darkened the skies over the Urals. Foreign capital poured in from French and Belgian banks, financing factories that produced locomotives, textiles, and heavy machinery at a pace that astonished European observers. But this breakneck industrialization came at a devastating human cost, as millions of impoverished peasants flooded into the overcrowded cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Warsaw, where they labored 14-hour shifts in freezing, unventilated factories for wages that barely covered the cost of bread. The new industrial working class, crammed into squalid barracks and tenement slums, nursed grievances that no amount of police surveillance could silence, creating a volatile social powder keg that waited only for a spark. When Alexander III died of kidney disease in 1894 at the age of 49, the crown passed to his 26-year-old son Nicholas II, a gentle, well-mannered, and fatally indecisive young man who was utterly unprepared for the crushing weight of imperial power. Nicholas was a devoted family man who preferred playing tennis and reading history to attending ministerial councils, and he possessed a romantic, almost mystical belief in the sacred bond between the Tsar and his people that blinded him to the political realities of the modern age. At his coronation festivities in May 1896, a catastrophic stampede at Kodinka Field in Moscow killed nearly 1,400 people who had gathered to receive commemorative cups and gifts, casting a dark omen over the entire reign. Nicholas's initial response to the growing demands for political participation was dismissive and tone-deaf, famously telling a delegation of Zemstvo representatives that their hopes for a consultative assembly were nothing more than senseless dreams. He relied heavily on the counsel of his strong-willed German-born wife Alexandra, whose deep religious mysticism and fierce protectiveness of their hemophiliac son Alexei would eventually draw the sinister figure of Grigory Rasputin into the innermost circles of imperial power. The first great crisis of Nicholas's reign came not from within, but from the far eastern frontier, where Russia's aggressive expansion into Manchuria and Korea collided with the rising ambitions of Imperial Japan. Russian military planners dismissed the Japanese as an inferior Asian power that would crumble before European military superiority, a catastrophic miscalculation rooted in racial arrogance and strategic ignorance. When the Japanese launched a devastating surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur in February 1904, the empire was plunged into a humiliating war that exposed every weakness of the imperial military machine. Russian armies suffered defeat after defeat on the Manchurian plains, while the Baltic Fleet, dispatched on an epic 7-month voyage around the globe to relieve the siege, was annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima in a single afternoon of carnage. The news of these catastrophic defeats filtered back into a society already seething with economic hardship, political frustration, and social despair, transforming military humiliation into a revolutionary conflagration. On the freezing morning of January 9, 1905, a massive crowd of over 150,000 workers and their families, led by the charismatic priest Father Georgy Gapon, marched through the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. They carried religious icons, portraits of the Tsar, and a humble petition begging Nicholas to grant them an 8-hour workday, fair wages, and basic civil liberties. The authorities, panicked by the sheer size of the demonstration and lacking any coherent orders from the absent Tsar, deployed infantry and cavalry to block the approaches to the palace. When the crowd refused to disperse, the soldiers opened fire with volleys of rifle shots into the densely packed masses of men, women, and children, killing hundreds and wounding thousands in a single morning of bloodshed that would be forever remembered as Bloody Sunday. The massacre destroyed the ancient myth of the benevolent little Father Tsar, who stood above corrupt officials and cared for his humble subjects. Across the empire, the shock of Bloody Sunday ignited a rolling wave of strikes, mutinies, and peasant uprisings that brought the autocracy to the very brink of collapse. Workers in St. Petersburg and Moscow formed the first Soviets, or councils of workers' deputies, to coordinate strike actions and challenge the authority of the state. In the countryside, peasants burned manor houses, seized grain stores, and drove terrified landlords from their ancestral estates. The crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied in the Black Sea, raising the red flag of revolution and bombarding the port city of Odessa. Facing the total disintegration of state authority, Nicholas was forced to issue the October Manifesto, drafted by the pragmatic Count Sergei Witt, which promised basic civil liberties and the creation of an elected legislative assembly called the State Duma. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed that Russia might finally cross the threshold into constitutional government. As political parties formed openly, newspapers debated freely, and workers celebrated in the streets. But the autocracy's concessions were never sincere, and as soon as the revolutionary momentum began to ebb, Nicholas moved to claw back every inch of ground he had surrendered. The electoral laws were rigged to favor the wealthy landowning classes. The Duma was repeatedly dissolved when it dared to challenge imperial prerogatives, and the revolutionary leaders were hunted down by the Okhrana and sentenced to Siberian exile or death. The regime's most capable champion during these turbulent years was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, a stern, iron-willed provincial governor who believed that Russia could be saved only through a combination of ruthless repression and deep agrarian reform. Stolypin's field courts-martial executed thousands of revolutionaries in a wave of hangings so relentless that the noose became grimly known as Stolypin's necktie. Simultaneously, he launched an ambitious program to dismantle the traditional peasant commune and create a new class of prosperous, independent farmers who would serve as a conservative bulwark against revolution. Stolypin famously declared that he needed 20 years of peace to transform Russia, but the forces of history would not grant him even 5, as he was assassinated at point-blank range in the Kiev Opera House in September 1911. When the guns of August 1914 shattered the peace of Europe, Russia entered the First World War with an initial outpouring of patriotic fervor that temporarily united all classes behind the throne. Crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace singing the national anthem. The Duma voted unanimously for war credits, and millions of peasant conscripts marched to the front carrying icons and singing hymns. But the euphoria of those early weeks dissolved rapidly into the grinding nightmare of industrial warfare, as the Russian army, brave but poorly equipped and incompetently led, suffered catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, and the front line stabilized only through the sheer expenditure of human life on a scale that defied comprehension. By the end of 1916, Russia had suffered more than 5 million casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, draining the nation of its young men and pushing the home front toward total economic collapse. The railway system, overwhelmed by the demands of military logistics, broke down completely, leaving grain rotting in southern warehouses while the cities of the north starved. Inflation devoured the wages of factory workers. Bread became a luxury item, and the queues outside Petrograd bakeries stretched for blocks in the freezing winter darkness. At the imperial court, the Tsaritsa Alexandra fell increasingly under the hypnotic influence of the Siberian mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose alleged ability to stop the bleeding of the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei gave him extraordinary power over the imperial family. Rasputin's scandalous behavior and his rumored interference in ministerial appointments destroyed whatever remained of the monarchy's public credibility, convincing millions of Russians that the throne had been captured by dark, treasonous forces. In February 1917, the accumulated pressures of 3 years of total war finally shattered the fragile social order of the Russian capital. A spontaneous strike by female textile workers protesting bread shortages merged with a general walkout by the city's industrial workforce, bringing more than 300,000 people into the frozen streets of Petrograd. When the garrison troops, composed largely of raw peasant conscripts who sympathized with the protesters, refused to fire on the crowds and instead turned their weapons against their own officers, the autocracy lost its last instrument of coercive power. Within 5 extraordinary days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty simply evaporated, dissolving like morning frost under the heat of popular fury. On March 2, 1917, aboard his imperial train at the railway station of Pskov, the last emperor of all Russia signed his act of abdication with a simple pencil, relinquishing the throne for himself and his son in favor of his brother Grand Duke Michael. When Michael declined the crown the following day, the Russian monarchy ceased to exist, replaced by a fragile provisional government that commanded neither the loyalty of the army nor the confidence of the masses. The provisional government, led by the eloquent but indecisive Alexander Kerensky, made the fatal decision to continue Russia's participation in the war, dooming the new republic as war-weary soldiers, peasants, and workers demanded immediate peace, land, and bread. Into this vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik faction, who seized the Winter Palace, the telegraph offices, and the railway stations on the night of October 25th in a swift, almost bloodless coup that transferred sovereign power to the Soviets. The former imperial family was placed under house arrest and shuffled between increasingly remote locations as the country descended into the apocalyptic violence of civil war. In the spring of 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and a handful of loyal servants were transferred to the Ipatov house in the Ural city of Ekaterinburg, a grim, heavily guarded merchant's mansion renamed the House of Special Purpose. For months, the family endured a monotonous, claustrophobic existence behind boarded-up windows and high wooden fences, passing the time with prayer, reading, and the quiet routines of domestic life. As anti-Bolshevik white armies advanced toward Ekaterinburg in the summer of 1918, the local Soviet authorities received orders to eliminate the Romanovs before they could be rescued. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family was awakened from their sleep, told they were being moved to a safer location, and led down a narrow staircase into a small, bare basement room. When Nicholas asked in confusion what was happening, the Commandant Yakov Yurovsky drew his revolver, announced that the sentence had been passed, and opened fire at point-blank range. The execution squad unleashed a hail of bullets into the cramped space, filling the room with smoke, plaster dust, and the screams of the wounded. When the gunfire finally ceased, the bodies of the last Tsar, his wife, his 5 children, and their 4 faithful servants lay tangled in a heap of blood-soaked clothing on the basement floor, marking the violent, irreversible end of a dynasty that had shaped the destiny of Eurasia for more than 3 centuries. The story of the Russian Empire is ultimately a story about the tragic, inescapable tension between the desire for order and the hunger for freedom, a tension that played out across 1,000 years of history on the vast, unforgiving stage of the Eurasian plain. From the river traders of Kievan Rus to the Mongol horsemen who burned their cities to ash, from the patient statecraft of Ivan Khalida to the terrifying madness of Ivan the Terrible, from the frozen chaos of the time of troubles to the glittering imperial splendor of Catherine the Great, the Russian state repeatedly solved its crises by concentrating power into ever fewer hands. Every reform that promised liberation was followed by a reaction that tightened the chains. Every moment of openness was succeeded by a retreat into suspicion and control, and every attempt to modernize the empire was undermined by the autocracy's fundamental terror of its own people. The empire that stretched across 11 time zones, that defeated Napoleon and built St. Petersburg on the bones of its serfs, that produced Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky alongside the knout and the Siberian exile, was a civilization of extraordinary creative power and extraordinary human suffering, often existing simultaneously within the same generation and the same city street. When the final curtain fell in that dark basement in Ekaterinburg, the world that the Romanovs had built did not simply vanish but transformed, flowing in altered and often darker forms into the Soviet century that followed. The rivers still flow through the forests, the steppe grass still bends under the eastern wind, and the ancient questions that haunted the first princes of Muscovy, how to hold together a vast and diverse land, how to balance security with liberty, how to modernize without losing one's soul, remain as urgent and unresolved today as they were 1,000 years ago.